The sun was beginning to sink behind the distant mountain range, casting long shadows across the dry, dusty plains of the Apache lands. The village was quiet, the usual bustle of activity simmering down as the night approached. But in the center of the camp, around the fire where the elders sat, there was a tension that hung in the air, like the dry heat of the desert. Tyan stood before her father, Chief Cochise, the man who had led their people with wisdom for years. His eyes, dark as the night sky, were steady, unwavering. Tyan had never been one to follow the rules. Ever since she was a child, she had rebelled against the expectations of the tribe, the traditions that had been passed down through generations. She had been warned, time and time again, to respect the laws of their people. But her defiance was stronger than any rule, and now for the third time, she had broken a sacred law. And this time, her father's patience had worn thin. 3 times, Tyan. Chief Cochise's voice was low but sharp. Each word was like a stone being thrown into the silence, breaking it apart. 3 times you have disrespected the laws of our people. You've put us all at risk. I cannot let this pass. The elders murmured amongst themselves, their voices a quiet hum that filled the space around them. Tyan clenched her fists at her sides, her heart racing. She had expected punishment, but not this. Not something so final. She lifted her head, her defiant eyes meeting her father's. I warned you, Tyan. You must learn that freedom is not without consequence. There is no place for a daughter of mine to disregard the rules. Her father's words cut through her like the desert wind, cold and harsh. He turned to face the council, his voice steady and authoritative. I will not banish her. I will not send her away from the tribe, but she will learn what it means to have discipline. Tyan's chest tightened. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. Banishment, that would have been easier to understand. At least then she could have fought to stay, to prove herself. But this was worse, much worse. I'm sending you to the farm on the border, Chief Cochise said, his gaze never leaving her. You will spend 3 months working under Brock, a man who knows the value of hard work. You will learn the discipline you lack. When those 3 months are up, you will return to us, a changed woman. If you survive the work. Tyan's heart skipped a beat. The border. Broke. The man who lived alone on the edge of their lands. A man with a reputation as cold as the steel of his rifle. She had heard stories of him, a soldier turned hermit, someone who didn't trust anyone. To be sent to him, it was worse than being banished. At least there, she could have run away. Here she would be trapped. No, father, she protested, her voice rising in anger. I won't go. I'm your daughter. You can't send me away like this. Chief Cochise's expression didn't change. He was immovable, as solid as the earth beneath them. The decision is made. You will leave in 2 days' time. You will go to the farm and you will work. Learn the value of the rules you've broken. You will learn that freedom has a price. Tyan stood there, fury and confusion boiling inside her. The fire in her chest was burning bright, but she could do nothing to change her father's mind. No one could. She had always been rebellious, but this time she had pushed too far. The consequence was set, and now she had no choice but to accept it. As the elders returned to their discussions, Tyan stood there, feeling the heat of the fire in front of her, but colder than she had ever felt in her life. The anger in her swelled, but beneath it, there was a creeping sense of dread. She was going to the farm, and when she returned, she would be a different person, or she would be broken. She turned and walked away, her heart heavy, the silence of the camp pressing down on her like the weight of 1,000 stones. The morning sun had barely risen over the horizon when Tyan mounted her horse, her grip tight on the reins, her heart heavy with the weight of her father's decision. The dry wind of the desert brushed against her skin, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of a journey ahead. The village she had grown up in, the village she would now leave behind, faded as she rode out, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of barren land that lay before her. The road was rough, winding through the dry, cracked earth. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of her horse's hooves as they beat a steady path through the desert. The horizon seemed endless, stretching on forever, just like the thoughts that swirled in Tyan's mind. She wasn't sure what to expect from this journey, or from the man named Brock, whom she was to serve for the next 3 months. He was a man with a reputation, cold and distant, a former soldier who had left the world behind. The stories she'd heard of him made him seem like a shadow, a man who didn't trust anyone and kept to himself. As the miles passed, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Tyan had been a free spirit, always following her own path, never bound by the rules her father had set for her. She had fought for her freedom, rebelling against the traditions of the tribe. But now as she rode alone through the unforgiving landscape, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This was different from the freedom she had once known. This was the kind of freedom that came with consequences, harsh, unforgiving consequences that she would now have to face. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Tyan's horse was moving slower now, its breath coming in ragged gas as it battled the heat. Tyan was beginning to feel the burn of the sun on her skin, her body aching from the long ride. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that wore her down. It was the mental weight of what was ahead. She had spent so many years resisting authority, fighting for her independence, but now she had to face the consequences of her actions. She could no longer deny the reality of it. She was being punished, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her thoughts turned to her father. How could he have done this to her? She had always thought he would understand her, that he would see her as more than just his daughter, but as someone with her own dreams, her own desires. Yet here she was, banished to the edge of the world, sent to learn discipline under a man who seemed as cold as the desert itself. Tyan couldn't understand it. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she could carve her own path. But now it felt like that path was closed to her, like she had been forced into a life she never wanted. As the day wore on, the landscape around her began to change. The dry, cracked earth gave way to scrubby bushes and twisted trees, their roots struggling to survive in the arid land. The silence of the desert was broken only by the occasional call of a hawk overhead, circling lazily in the sky. Tyan's mind wandered as she rode, the harsh landscape mirroring the turmoil inside her. She had always been proud, always been certain of her place in the world. But now as the journey stretched on, she began to realize that she had no idea what lay ahead. The farm, Brock, the work she would be forced to do, it was all a mystery, one she had no choice but to face. The first day of the journey ended as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting the desert in a fiery glow. Tyan stopped to make camp, the weight of the day's ride pressing heavily on her shoulders. She felt the sting of the sunburn on her skin, but it was the pain in her chest that hurt the most. She had been sent away. She had been rejected. And as she sat by the fire, looking out over the vast desert, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find her way back to the life she had once known. The wind picked up, howling through the desert, stirring the dust around her like the ghosts of the past. Tyan sat in silence, staring into the flames. The flickering firelight cast shadows across her face, her expression hard, but her heart soft with doubt. She had been defiant, and now she had to face the consequences. Would she find the discipline her father hoped she would learn? Or would she break beneath the weight of it all? Only time would tell. For now, all she could do was keep riding, keep moving forward, until she reached the farm. Tyan rode for hours, the last rays of sunlight casting an orange glow across the dry, barren landscape. The farm was much farther than she had anticipated, and as she finally approached it, the sight before her wasn't much more than a collection of dilapidated buildings surrounded by a sagging fence. The land was vast but lifeless, just like the stories she'd heard about the man she was about to meet. She dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. The dust clung to her skin as she straightened up, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The house was made of weather-beaten wood, the roof sagging in places, and the air smelled of earth and sweat. The barn sat to the side, a place of quiet solitude, but it was the figure standing near the porch that caught her attention. Brook stood there, leaning against the post with his arms crossed. His frame was tall and thick, his face rugged with a beard that seemed as wild as the land around them. His eyes, however, were the coldest thing about him, piercing yet distant, as if the man had long given up any hope of connecting with the world around him. Tyan felt a chill run down her spine, but she swallowed it down. This was the man she had been sent to. Brooke didn't move as she approached, his gaze never leaving the horizon. He was a man of few words, but the stories she had heard painted him as a man who let his actions speak louder than any words could. "Are you Brock?" Tyan asked, her voice firm, though the question came out more like a demand than a request. Brock finally turned his head to look at her. His eyes were unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps amusement or annoyance. She couldn't tell. "You're late," he said, his voice deep and rough, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "We start now." Tyan's chest tightened. She had expected him to say something, to offer some kind of greeting, but instead he only issued commands, as if she were just another part of his routine. She felt a rush of frustration flare up inside her. "I just got here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been riding for hours." Brock didn't acknowledge her comment. Instead, he nodded toward the barn. "Horses need feeding. Go. I'll show you what else needs doing after." Tyan stared at him, stunned. This was how it was going to be? No questions answered, no explanations. Just work. Her mind raced with anger. She had been sent here as a punishment, but she hadn't expected to be treated like a laborer. No, like a slave. Her chest tightened, her hands clenched into fists as she walked toward the barn. The tasks Brock set for her were simple enough, but they were exhausting. She fed the animals, shoveled hay into the troughs, and then moved on to repair the broken fence, her hands raw from handling the rough wood. Every task felt like an assault on her body, and each passing hour made her more and more furious. But it wasn't the work that angered her the most. It was the way Brock acted like she wasn't even there. He didn't offer any help, didn't speak unless it was to give her another chore. When she needed to fix a fence post, he stood at a distance, his eyes never leaving her work. It was as if he couldn't care less whether she succeeded or failed, and that stung more than anything else. She felt her frustration building as she worked into the late afternoon. The sun was dipping low in the sky, and the heat from the desert still clung to the air. Tyan wiped the sweat from her brow and slammed another nail into the post. She wanted to scream, to throw the hammer down and march out of here, but she knew she couldn't. This was her punishment. This was what her father had chosen for her. She turned to Brock, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "I didn't come here to be treated like this. I'm not your slave." Brock's gaze finally met hers. There was no anger in his eyes, no sympathy, just a cool detachment that made her blood boil. "You're not my slave," he said, his voice even, "but you'll work. That's what you'll learn here. If you can't do that, then you can leave." Tyan's fist clenched as she fought back the urge to shout. She stood there for a moment, trying to control her breathing, trying to hold back the tears of frustration that stung at the corners of her eyes. But she couldn't leave, not yet. She had no choice. With a deep breath, she turned back to her work. Each strike of the hammer was a reminder of her father's decision and of the life she'd left behind. As the last light of the day faded, Tyan could feel the weight of the land pressing down on her, as if the earth itself were reminding her of her place. She was here to learn discipline, and whether she liked it or not, this was the path she had to follow. The sun hung high in the sky, burning down on the land like a relentless beast. Tyan's neck burned with every drop of sweat that slid down her skin, and her hands stung from the rough, unforgiving wood she was forced to handle. It had only been a few hours since she'd arrived at the farm, but already the work had started to feel endless. The fences needed repairing, and there was no time to rest. Brooke had given her the task without a word, only pointing in the direction of the work that needed doing. She had started with the fence, using the hammer and nails to secure the posts, but the heat made everything feel heavier than it was. The nails were sharp and difficult to drive in, and the wood was splintered, tearing at her hands. By the time she'd moved on to feeding the animals, her hands were raw, blood dripping from a few deep cuts where the nails had pried into her skin. She had never been one for hard labor like this. Back at the village, her life had been free, with the wind in her hair and no one telling her what to do. Now, every movement felt like an insult to her spirit. She could feel her body weakening with each chore, but she pushed on, trying to ignore the throbbing in her arms and the pain that swirled in her chest. Brooke never said a word. He didn't offer help. He didn't offer guidance. He stood from a distance, watching her with cold eyes, never lifting a finger to ease her struggle. Each time she glanced over at him, he was the same, motionless, distant, like a shadow against the sun. He wasn't kind, nor was he cruel. He was simply there, as unmoving as the land itself. The animals were restless in the heat, and Tyan had to feed them quickly before they became more agitated. She poured feed into the troughs, feeling the dust settle in her throat as she worked. The goats bleated, the chickens clucked in irritation, and she could feel the weight of their hunger pressing down on her like the heat of the sun. Her muscles burned with each motion, each repetition of the task she had to perform. When she finally reached the well to collect water, her legs were shaky, and she could barely hold the bucket steady as she lowered it into the deep, still water below. She pulled it up, the rope rough against her palms, and then carried the water to the animals' drinking spots, each step feeling like it took more effort than the last. The sun was no less forgiving, and she had barely noticed how much time had passed. By the time the sky began to turn an orange hue, signaling the evening's arrival, Tyan had lost count of how many times she had filled the water buckets, repaired the fence, and fed the animals. Each movement felt like a burden, each task pulling her closer to the edge of her endurance. But still, Brock watched from a distance, never offering a single word of encouragement or a look of approval. He had given her the task, and now he was simply waiting for it to be done. There was no help, no guidance, only silence. Tyan felt her frustration rise, her teeth gritted against the strain. She wanted to scream, to throw down the bucket and walk away, but she knew she couldn't. She had promised herself she would finish what her father had set her to do, no matter how hard it was. She would show him, show Brock, that she could do it. But the weight of it all was crushing. Her body ached, her muscles screamed for rest. But the farm demanded more. The sun refused to relent, and neither did the tasks that seemed to multiply with every passing minute. She glanced back at Brock, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, something to tell her she wasn't alone in this. But his face remained unchanged, as impassive as ever. His cold eyes were still fixed on the horizon, not once shifting toward her. Her chest tightened with a mixture of anger and frustration. Why was he treating her this way? She was trying. She was working as hard as she could, and yet it felt like she was invisible to him. Tyan dropped the bucket and sank to her knees in the dirt. Tears of frustration burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give in. She had come this far, and she would finish what she started, no matter how hard it was. She stood up, wiping the sweat from her brow, and picked up the bucket once more. The sun was dipping lower, the light now softer as the evening coolness began to settle in. But Tyan didn't notice. She was too focused on the work that still lay ahead, on the task that was never ending. And in the silence that stretched between her and Brock, she understood something. This wasn't just about the work. This was about proving herself, to him, to her father, and to herself. The day was far from over, but Tyan wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. The fire crackled in the center of the camp, its flames dancing wildly in the cool desert night. Tyan sat on a flat rock, her body aching, her mind still racing from the day's hard labor. The heat of the fire provided little comfort against the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. She was used to the land's harshness, but this was something different. It was as if every task had pulled a little more of her soul from her. Brock sat across from her, his figure a dark silhouette against the firelight. His face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames as if they held some secret only he could understand. He hadn't said a word since they returned to camp, not even when she had dropped the bucket by the barn in frustration. He hadn't offered help, hadn't given her any encouragement. It was as if he were a part of the land itself, unmoved by the struggles around him. Tyan glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His silence had been unnerving, but something about it made her want to break it. She needed to know why he was like this, why he lived alone, why he didn't seem to care about anything or anyone. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. "Why do you live alone?" she asked, watching him closely. "No family, no friends? How can you just exist like this?" Brock didn't answer immediately. He continued to stare at the fire, the light casting shadows over his rugged face. For a moment, Tyan thought he might ignore her, like he had ignored her before. But then, After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Because I have nothing left," he said, his words almost swallowed by the crackling of the flames. "I lost everything once, the people I loved, the life I thought I could have. And now there's no point in going back. There's nothing to go back to." Honey, Tyan felt a shift in the air, like the wind had changed direction. She watched him carefully, the weight of his words settling over her like a cold blanket. She had always known that Brooke was a man of few words, but hearing him speak like this, so raw, so open, struck her harder than anything he had said before. "What happened?" she asked, almost in a whisper, as if the answer might shatter the stillness of the night. Brooke's eyes flickered for the first time, but he didn't look at her. He turned his gaze back to the fire, his face hardening again as the memories seemed to take hold of him. "I used to be part of something," he said, his tone distant, as if he were talking about someone else. "I was in the army. I fought in a war that wasn't mine. When it ended, I came home to nothing, just the dust and the ghosts of the people I had lost." Tyan's heart tightened. She had heard rumors, whispers of Brock's past, of the soldier he had once been. But hearing it from his own mouth felt different, more real. She could sense the pain in his words, the weight of a past that still haunted him. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her voice softer now, the anger from earlier replaced with something else. Curiosity, maybe even pity. "If it was so bad, why didn't you try to come back? Why didn't you fight for a new life?" Brooke was silent for a long time. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the otherwise still night. Finally, he spoke again, his voice even quieter this time. "I didn't know how," he said, "and maybe I didn't want to. After everything I saw, everything I did, I didn't know if I deserved a second chance." Tyan looked at him, her mind racing. There was so much more she wanted to ask, so many questions she had about him. But in that moment, she realized that some things couldn't be answered with words. Some things just had to be understood in silence. She let out a slow breath, her eyes never leaving him. "You're not the only one who's lost," she said softly, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "I've lost too, and maybe that's why I've been so angry. I didn't know how to deal with it." Brooke turned his head then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since they'd sat down. There was something in his gaze, something that softened the coldness she had grown used to. A recognition, maybe, an understanding. The fire crackled once more, sending sparks into the night sky. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. There was no anger between them now, no frustration, just two people, sitting in the quiet of the desert, each carrying their own burdens. Tyan felt the weight of her own walls slowly begin to crumble, just a little. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly understand Brock, or if he could ever truly understand her. But for the first time since she arrived at the farm, she felt like they weren't so different after all. She glanced up at the stars above, her breath steadying as she took in the vastness of the night. The firelight flickered, casting shadows on the ground, and for a brief moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they could find some kind of peace here in the silence. The night air was cool against Tyan's skin as she sat inside the small cabin, the warmth from the fire still lingering in her bones. The day had been another hard one. Long hours of work under the sun, followed by the silence of the evening. Brooke had remained mostly silent as usual, his mood as unchanging as the land around them. But tonight, there was a strange stillness in the air, one that unsettled Tyan. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a sense that something wasn't right. Suddenly, a long, eerie howl cut through the night, sending a chill down her spine. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood up quickly, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the sound of a single wolf. It was a pack. The howls echoed, growing louder, closer. Tyan rushed to the door, throwing it open to see the dark shadows moving just beyond the barn. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the land, but the figures in the distance were clear. Wolves. A pack of them, hungry and determined, moving with a sense of urgency. She didn't hesitate. Her pulse raced as she ran toward the barn, calling for Brock, but he was already there, his rifle in hand. He looked at her with a steely expression, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. We have to protect the animals, Brock said, his voice calm, but there was an edge of urgency in it. Get a torch. Now. Tayan didn't ask any questions. She grabbed a thick branch from the pile of firewood near the door and set it alight with the remnants of the dying fire. The flames flickered brightly, casting an orange glow on her face as she ran to join Brock, who was already moving toward the barn, his steps sure and measured. The wolves had made their move. The goats were already on edge, bleeding in fear as the pack closed in. Tayan's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Brock into the chaos. She could hear the wolves growling, their eyes glowing in the darkness as they moved swiftly, their bodies low to the ground like shadows. Without warning, the first wolf lunged at the barn door, trying to push past Brock. He swung the rifle, hitting the wolf squarely in the side, but the creature didn't back down. It snarled and snapped, its teeth bared. Another wolf charged forward, its jaws snapping dangerously close to Brock's arm. Tayan screamed and rushed forward, holding the torch high. She swung it at the nearest wolf, its eyes wild with fear and hunger. The wolf recoiled, yelping in pain as the flames singed its fur. But it didn't retreat. None of them did. Brock fired again, but the wolves were relentless, more of them emerging from the darkness, circling the barn like a pack of demons. The air was thick with the sound of snarls and the crackle of the fire. Tayan felt her body tense, every instinct telling her to fight or run. But there was no running. One of the wolves darted forward, catching Brock off guard. It lunged at his arm, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh. Brock let out a strangled cry, dropping the rifle as the wolf pulled him down. Blood spilled from his wound, dark and thick against the night. Tayan's heart lurched. Without thinking, she ran toward him, thrusting the torch forward to drive the attacking wolf away. The flames hit its side and the wolf yelped, but it didn't fully retreat. Tayan swung the torch again, forcing it back, and with a final growl, the wolf released Brock's arm, retreating into the darkness. "Brock!" Tayan cried, her voice frantic as she knelt beside him. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes were still clear. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice rough. "Get the rifle. We need to finish this." Tayan looked around, her mind racing. The wolves were still circling, waiting for another chance to strike. She grabbed the rifle from the ground, her hands shaking as she held it up, the weight of the weapon unfamiliar in her grasp. Brock was on his feet again, though he swayed slightly from the pain. Together they stood, their backs to the barn, facing the wolves that were now retreating into the shadows. The danger wasn't over, but at least for now they had fought them off. Tayan's chest heaved as she caught her breath, the firelight flickering between them, casting long shadows on the barn walls. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their heavy breathing and the crackling of the fire. "We make a good team," Brock said quietly, his voice surprisingly calm for someone who had just been nearly torn apart by wolves. Tayan didn't say anything at first. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. But there was something in his words, something that made her look at him differently. She had thought he was just a cold, distant man, a man who didn't care about anyone. But in that moment, she saw something else. He wasn't just a hardened survivor. He was someone who had faced the darkness and lived to fight another day. The wolves were gone for now. The night was still. But in the quiet that followed, Tayan felt something shift between them, an understanding. She had helped him, not out of obligation, but because she knew what it meant to fight for survival. The fire crackled behind them, the flames dancing in the night as they both stood there, side by side. The bond between them had been forged in the firelight and in the darkness that surrounded them. The air inside the cabin felt thick with the heat of the fire as Tayan knelt beside Brock. His face was pale, the blood from his wound already dried and crusted, but he still groaned softly in his sleep, a low, painful sound. The night had passed uneventfully, the wolves no longer a threat, but the wound Brock had suffered was a reminder of the danger they had faced together. Tayan had managed to patch up the wound with what little supplies they had, using desert herbs she had learned about from her father and a bit of cloth she found in the cabin. She had cleaned the wound as best as she could, but there was little she could do to stop the fever that was beginning to take hold of him. She watched over him as he lay on the rough bed, his breathing shallow, his body tense with the pain that he refused to acknowledge. Hours passed, and just as the moon reached its highest point, Brock began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, his face twisting in discomfort. For a moment, Tyan thought he was still lost to the fever, but then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, strained and thick. I didn't want it to be this way, Brock mumbled, his words slurring as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Tyan leaned in, trying to make sense of the broken sentences. What do you mean? She asked softly, unsure if he was even aware she was there. Brock's hand twitched, his eyes barely focusing on her. His voice was hoarse, carrying a weight of regret and sorrow. I didn't choose to fight. I didn't choose to hurt your people. Tyan's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the rumors, the whispers about Brock's past, but hearing it from him, hearing the shame in his voice made her stomach twist in a way she couldn't explain. He had been a soldier who fought against her people. Her mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other. Could this be true? Could the man she had been working beside, the man who had shown her no warmth, have been part of the very conflict that had torn her people apart? Brock's voice grew weaker, his words more broken. They told me. They said we were saving the land, protecting the settlers. But when we got to the valley, everything changed. Tyan's breath caught in her throat. Her father had spoken of the battle in the river valley, the conflict between the soldiers and the Apache. She had always heard of it in hushed tones, a wound that had never fully healed in her tribe. And now here she was, sitting beside the very man who had been a part of it. Brock's eyes closed again, but his grip on the blanket tightened, as if the past was suffocating him. I couldn't do it, he whispered. I couldn't shoot. Not after everything I saw. Tyan's heart pounded in her chest. He had been there on the other side. He had been one of the soldiers. The ones who had fought against her people, the ones who had killed. Her mind reeled. How could he have been a part of that? How could he have fought against the Apache, against his own people, and then come back to live a life like this? A wave of anger and confusion washed over her. How could she trust him now? The man she had begun to see in a different light, the man who had helped her during the wolf attack, the man who had shown no signs of the past she now learned about. How could she see him the same way? She stood up suddenly, her heart a storm inside her. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, her voice rising in fury. Why didn't you tell me what you did? All this time I thought you were just a man who had given up. I never knew you were part of the army that slaughtered my people. Brock's eyes opened slowly, his expression unreadable, his pain etched deeply in the lines of his face. I didn't know how to tell you, he said quietly, his voice hoarse and broken. I didn't know how to face it. How to face you. Tyan felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions twisting into something raw and painful. She had trusted him. She had allowed herself to believe that he was someone she could respect, someone who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. But now everything felt like a lie. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, the lessons of their people, the importance of honor, of truth, of loyalty. She had learned them her entire life, but now they seemed so distant. How could she forgive him for what he had done? How could she reconcile the man in front of her with the man who had fought against her family? Tyan took a step back, her eyes searching Brock's face, but she saw nothing that could reassure her, nothing that could make the past disappear. Her body shook, and for the first time, she felt truly alone in this place. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly, the words heavy in her mouth. But I don't know how to hate you either. Brock looked up at her, his eyes filled with a sadness she couldn't bear to look at. Your father is a good man, he whispered. He forgave me, and I've been trying to make up for it ever since. Tyan stood there, her heart torn between the man she was learning about and the man she had been fighting beside. The world felt suddenly very small, the distance between them a chasm that no words could bridge. But the silence that hung between them was something she couldn't ignore. She had to choose, whether to hold on to the pain of the past or to move forward, however difficult that might be. The night stretched on, and in the darkness, Tyan couldn't find an answer. She only knew that the path ahead was unclear and the future uncertain. But for now, she sat back down, her back to the wall, her mind spinning. knowing she couldn't move forward until she had figured out what to do with the truth she had just uncovered. The winds began to pick up in the late afternoon, howling across the dry plains, stirring the dust into swirling clouds. Tyan stood in the doorway of the cabin, her eyes narrowing as the first gusts of the storm hit, sending the dirt flying in every direction. The sky, once clear, was now darkening rapidly, and the horizon was fading behind a thick orange veil of dust. A sandstorm was coming, a fierce one, and she could feel the change in the air, as though the land itself was about to unleash its fury. Tyan's mind raced. She had spent the last few days with a constant ache in her chest, a feeling that had only grown since the revelation of Brock's past. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, everything had built up inside her like a storm waiting to break. And now, with the winds howling and the storm approaching, she felt as though she had reached her breaking point. Without a word, she grabbed the reins of her horse, her mind set on something, anything that could make her feel free again. She needed to escape, to run, to leave behind everything that had become so tangled, so suffocating. She mounted the horse quickly, urging it forward with a sharp command, not bothering to look back at Brock, who had watched her silently from across the yard. The storm hit full force as she rode, the wind lashing against her face, stinging her skin with the grit of the desert. The sky above was nothing but a swirling cloud of sand and dust, the world reduced to an endless blur of orange. Tyan's horse moved fast, its hooves pounding against the earth, but the storm was stronger than her. The wind whipped around her, pushing her in every direction, and soon she could barely see anything at all. Her heart raced, the familiar feeling of freedom mixing with a deep sense of isolation. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? To be alone, to find her own path, away from the man she'd come to know, the man who had betrayed her with his past. But now, in the heart of the storm, she felt nothing but fear and confusion. She had wanted to run from everything, the pain, the anger, the uncertainty. But now, as the storm surrounded her, she realized that she was running from herself. She didn't know what she wanted anymore. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that she couldn't stay in this place, not with the storm of emotions swirling inside her. And then, as the wind howled louder, something in the distance caught her eye. A dark figure appeared through the sand and dust, moving with purpose toward her. She squinted, but the storm made it hard to make out the details. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized him. Brock. He was riding straight into the storm, his face grim but determined. Tyan's breath caught in her throat as he pulled his horse closer, his voice cutting through the noise of the wind. "Tyan, you're lost in the storm. Come back." But Tyan didn't answer. She couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to speak, to face him after everything that had happened. After the anger, the betrayal, and the truth that had shaken her to the core. She wanted to be free, but she didn't know how to find it. Brock reached her side, pulling his horse alongside hers. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached out, grabbing her reins, pulling her horse to a stop. The wind howled between them, but there was something in his eyes that made Tyan stop fighting. "I'm not letting you go," he said firmly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Not like this, not in the storm." Tyan looked at him, the sand swirling around them both. She could see the concern in his eyes and something else, something softer, a flicker of understanding that made her feel like she wasn't alone. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt like he wasn't just a stranger. He wasn't just a man with a past she couldn't forgive. He was someone who cared, someone who was here for her, in the storm, when everything else was falling apart. Tyan's chest tightened, her emotions crashing over her like the wind and sand. She wanted to shout, to tell him everything that was wrong, everything she couldn't make sense of. But all that came out was a shaky breath. "Why do you care?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Brock didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Because I understand what it's like to feel lost, to want to run, but you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." In that moment, with the storm howling around them, Tyan felt something shift inside her. The anger that had been building for days started to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, something she hadn't expected to feel. She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on Brock's arm. The storm was still fierce, but she no longer felt like she was fighting it alone. The days after the storm were quieter, the air heavy with the tension that still hung between them. Brock had done what he could to prove his willingness to make amends. He had spent the next few days helping Tyann repair the barn, fixing what was broken, and working alongside her without a word of complaint. His actions spoke volumes, though they did little to erase the history that lay between them. But Tyann was still wrestling with the truth. Every time she looked at him, she saw the soldier who had fought against her people, who had been part of the bloodshed that had torn her tribe apart. The anger still burned in her chest, though it had cooled somewhat, tempered by time and the moments they had shared since the storm. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land, Tyann stopped what she was doing and turned to Brock, her eyes narrowed in determination. He had been working in the field, sweat glistening on his brow, his movements as steady as ever. But now, standing in the doorway of the cabin, Tyann knew it was time to face what had been left unsaid. "I need to know," she said, her voice low but firm. "I need you to tell me the truth about everything. About why you chose to fight. About why you didn't stop. Why didn't you walk away?" Brock looked up at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something like regret in his eyes. He stood still for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The silence stretched between them, thick with the history they had yet to confront. Finally, he set the hoe down and walked over to her. "I didn't choose it," he said, his voice rough. "I was a soldier. I was trained to fight. I didn't question the orders. Not at first. I was told we were defending something, protecting the settlers. I didn't think about the people I was hurting. I didn't see the faces of those I was killing. I was just doing my job. But when I saw the children, the families, I knew I couldn't keep doing it. I couldn't keep being the man they wanted me to be." Tien's chest tightened. Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard the words before, but hearing them from his mouth, hearing the pain in his voice, made it all the more real. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just someone who had killed without thought. He was someone who had been broken by the very war he had fought in. "I don't know what I expected," Brock continued, his gaze shifting to the ground as if he couldn't bear to look her in the eye. "But I know this. I can't undo what I've done. I can't bring back the people I've hurt. All I can do is try to make it right. Try to live in a way that shows I'm sorry for the pain I caused." Tyann stood there, the weight of his words sinking in, the fire of her anger slowly dissipating as the truth settled in her heart. She had wanted revenge. She had wanted to make him feel the same pain that had been inflicted on her people. But now, seeing the genuine sorrow in his eyes, she realized that forgiveness wasn't about making him suffer. It was about healing the wound, both his and hers. She took a deep breath, stepping closer to him, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, the words heavier than she expected. "But I know I don't want to carry this anger anymore. I can't keep holding on to it. Not forever." Brooke's eyes flickered with relief, but there was still a sadness in them. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched her arm, a silent plea for understanding. "I've done terrible things, Tyann, and I can't change the past. But I want to try, with you, if you'll let me." For a moment, Tyann said nothing. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had fought for redemption, the man who had shown her kindness, and yes, the man who had broken her heart. But in that moment, she also saw something else. A man who was trying to change, trying to make amends, trying to be better than the man he had been. "I don't know what's ahead of us," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we can start over. We can try to build something from the wreckage." Brock nodded, his eyes softening, the weight of his past still heavy but no longer crushing. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I'll work to earn your trust every single day." Tyann looked out toward the horizon, the setting sun casting long shadows over the land, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness never was, but perhaps it was the only way forward. Together they would face the past, the present, and whatever the future held. And as the darkness fell around them, they stood there side by side, ready to rebuild what had been broken, piece by piece, until it was whole again. 3 months had passed since Tyan first arrived at the farm. The days had become a blur of hard work, blistered hands, and countless lessons learned in the quiet moments between tasks. She had come to understand what it meant to work for something, to put in the sweat and the effort, and to feel the satisfaction of a day's labor. The once unfamiliar aches of her body had become a reminder of how far she had come. The impatience that had once burned so fiercely inside her had softened, replaced by a patience she had never known she could have. Brock had remained steadfast, a silent observer, but always there when needed. Over time, she had come to see him in a different light, no longer just the man with a haunted past, but someone who had given everything to survive and rebuild, just as she was now doing. His gruff exterior had slowly chipped away, revealing the man beneath, the man who had fought for redemption. He hadn't said much, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could, and Tyan had changed too. She wasn't the same rebellious, angry woman who had first arrived, filled with bitterness and rage. The weight of her father's decision, the anger toward Brock, and the fear of the unknown had all faded, replaced by something clearer, understanding. She had learned to forgive, not just Brock, but herself too. The past could never be erased, but it no longer defined her. As the day of her departure approached, Tyan found herself at a crossroads. She had come here to learn discipline, to face the pain of the past, and to prove something to herself. And now, as the morning sun stretched over the horizon, she was ready to go home. Not because she was forced to, but because she had earned the right to return to her family, to her people, with a new understanding of what truly mattered. Tyan packed her things in silence, her heart heavy, but not with the same weight it had once carried. She looked around the small cabin, the place that had been both a prison and a sanctuary. In some ways, it had been her salvation. It had shown her strength she didn't know she had, and it had taught her the meaning of perseverance. But now it was time to move forward. Brock stood by the fence as she saddled her horse, his eyes fixed on her, as always, watching but saying nothing. He had become a steady presence in her life, the man who had shown her that change was possible, and that redemption was not just a word. It was something you worked for every day. But now their paths were diverging. Tyan had to go back, and Brock had his own journey to finish. Tyan paused for a moment, looking at him. She could see the storm in his eyes, the same kind of struggle she had seen when they first met. He had never been good with goodbyes, and she understood that now. "I'm leaving," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight she hadn't expected. "I'm going back to my family, but not in anger, not in shame." Brock nodded, his face unreadable. But his eyes softened, and for the first time in months, she saw something in them. Something that wasn't guarded or cold, but vulnerable, like he was finally letting go of something. "I know," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "You've learned what you came here to. You've learned more than I could have taught you." Tyan felt the sting of the unspoken words between them. She had come here with a purpose, and now she was leaving with something more. It wasn't just about the lessons of hard work or discipline. It was about understanding, about forgiveness, and about letting go of the past so it didn't control her future. "I won't forget what you did for me," she said, her voice soft. "I won't forget what we've learned, both of us. And I hope you find peace." Brock didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, as if measuring the weight of her words. Then finally he nodded once, sharply. "Take care of yourself," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "And don't forget, there's always a place here for you." Tyan mounted her horse, her heart full but not heavy. She turned and rode toward the horizon, not looking back, but carrying the lessons of the past with her. The land stretched out before her, wide and open, a world full of possibilities. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. As she disappeared into the distance, the wind swept through the desert, carrying with it a sense of new beginnings. Brock stood by the fence for a long time, watching until she was just a shadow against the vast open sky. The storm had passed, and now it was time to rebuild, to move forward. Not alone, but together, each in their own way.